this thing called schlep blindness, where John and Patrick decided that this was really something that no one should have to do, and started the company based on that belief. And it kind of grew from there. But also, I think we had some really interesting projects that led to more awareness. So back in 2012.
Hi, Anurag. Thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciate. First of all, I just want to introduce you to the public. Obviously, you're the CEO and founder of Render. Render is an amazing tool to build and run apps and websites. So, for example, Clearbit, 99 Designs, and even Socket Security, who announced their funding round. Render also recently announced their Series B funding round. So Anurag is the CEO and founder. And besides that, most people don't know, but Anurag was also the 8th employee at Stripe, early employee at Stripe. And so let's start with that. So, I mean, you have an amazing background, at building Render, which is an amazing tool, but also at Stripe. Can you tell us a little bit more how you end up joining Stripe? What attracted you to the company, and how did you discover it?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to chat, and looking forward to the next hour or so. So Stripe, I first started using the product, which was back then the company was called /dev/payments in I think it was November of 2010. And I was probably one of the first 20, 25 users who were using it for real things. And the product was still pretty immature in many ways. And so I was giving them a lot of feedback. And that's how I got to know the team a little bit. The team back then was 4 people, including the founders. And as I kept giving them feedback, it became clear to kind of both sides that we enjoyed talking to each other and thinking about the product, thinking about the engineering issues. And then eventually, in July of 2011, a few months after I started using Stripe, they changed their name in March of that year, I think March of 2011, to Stripe. I'm glad that they did. And I was working from home for a different company back then, but I enjoyed the vibe in their office. I visited the office a couple of times. And so when they asked me if I would be interested in joining, I decided to chat more, and that's how I ended up there. So I started in August of 2011, and this was before Stripe launched. We were just getting ready for launch. And I remember writing the very first tutorial for how to use Stripe. That was my first contribution to Stripe. Obviously, I came in as an engineer, but we didn't really have anyone writing docs. All the engineers wrote their own docs. And so the tutorial no one had written so far. And I remember the launch on Hacker News, I believe it was September 29th of 2011, and things grew from there.
That's cool. I have a picture that Paul Graham shared on Twitter. I don't know if you can see there.
I can.
Here's a picture. That's the office that you were talking about, right?
That is absolutely the office I'm talking about. It was a really great building, Palo Alto, University Avenue. It was a really nice setting and a great place to just keep your head down and focus on building the product and launching. And then we moved to San Francisco in January of 2012. And so this picture was taken right before we moved.
That's cool. That's awesome. It's awesome to see this cool picture of early days of Stripe and what it has become. It has become such an important company inside the valley and the globe, because a lot of the volume, transaction volume, is done through Stripe. So let's dive in a little bit more into your experience at Stripe. So you joined early on, and you were head of risk at Stripe. Is that right?
Yeah, that happened later. I was an engineer and I focused on building out some of the financial systems. And then I ended up focusing on growth for a little bit, um, mostly because no one else wanted to do it. And then we hired people who could focus on it exclusively. And then I started working on building risk engineering systems. So things that prevented Stripe from losing too much money because of fraud. And as a payments provider, the margins are relatively low. So any kind of fraud volume, you have to make sure that you're calibrating it and making sure that you're not losing too much money, but also that it's fine to take on some fraud, because if you don't have any fraud at all, it means you're being too restrictive with your risk practices. And you are almost certainly banning real legitimate users, or preventing them from using your platform. So it has to be the right amount of fraud. And that was really what the risk engineering team was doing, along with an operations team, which I helped create also. So as part of the risk team, I ended up building out a team of operations folks, analysts, and engineers, as head of risk, in the second half of my stay at Stripe.
That's interesting. So let's dive in a little bit more into your experience there. So I would imagine when you joined, there were not that many companies that were using Stripe, maybe less than 100. I'm not too sure. But, when you end up leaving Stripe, it was a much different company by then,
Of
right? So
course.
there were a lot of companies there. What were the lessons that you've learned growing Stripe and growing inside the company? Like what are some interesting tidbits that you've learned there?
Um, Specifically around growth, I think Stripe really focused on product-led growth, organic growth, and supplemented it with some press, which, because Stripe had all these products and had really impressive founders, really young founders, it was a little bit easier for us to get press. Also, we had great investors. Um, and so that combined with a really great experience when people actually started using Stripe, those were really the biggest growth levers for us. Um, we never really, at least when I was there, we never really spent money on ads. I think that might have changed now, of course. But we did focus heavily on making the experience great for every customer. And in the beginning, most of our customers were developers, and we were all developers, and we kind of spoke their language, and it was really important for us to give developers a great experience, not just in the product, but also in the docs and in how they interacted with customer support. So all of that, I think in the early days made a huge difference. And in that sense, I think Stripe was very different from any of the other payment providers out there. Um, we made it very easy to get started, and then we allowed you to scale, and we placed a lot of importance on the stability of the platform, on on the speed, on the security of the platform. And so all of these things helped Stripe scale with its customers. And that was really the biggest thing. So getting a lot of people in and then scaling with them as they grew, helped Stripe increase its payment volume tremendously over the first 2 or 3 years.
Interesting. So what Stripe did differently was basically didn't spend as much money in ads, right? And it focused a lot on appearing on like on news, hacker news, things like that, right? And is that part of it, or there
I
are
think
different areas that? Yeah, go ahead.
so. I don't think Stripe actively focused back then, at least, and I'm sure now
Hmm.
too, on appearing on Hacker News. But we ended up on Hacker News anyway, and a lot of that had to do with Paul Graham early on saying really nice things about Stripe. He wrote a whole essay about this thing called schlep blindness, where John and Patrick decided that this was really something that no one should have to do, and started the company based on that belief. Um, and it kind of grew from there. But also, I think we had some really interesting um, projects that led to more awareness. So back in 2012, we organized our first Capture the Flag competition, which was really popular with developers and especially folks who cared about security. And that also raised our profile a lot with developers who both became customers, but also ended up joining Stripe as a result.
What can you describe a little bit more about Capture the Flag? I wasn't aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Stripe does it anymore, but it was essentially a competition where you had to solve puzzles through code, and it was a sequence of things so you could finally get to the flag, as it were. Um, and it was really interesting set of puzzles or programming um, problems to solve. And a lot of people spent a lot of time on it and were really excited by the prospect of doing it quickly. And we gave out a bunch of t-shirts, and we had sort of this online community around it. So it was a lot of fun. And I think it was almost like an extension of the kind of programming competitions or puzzles that people often do in school. Um, and we just did this globally, and I think it was a lot of developers really appreciated the set of problems and competitions and the whole thing around it. So that was a lot of fun. And then it took up a lot of time, obviously, from the engineering team to design these competitions and puzzles, but it also showed the rest of the developer community that we cared about security, that we cared about um, engineering craft, and that meant that they could rely on us, and also meant that we had great engineers on the team who other great engineers would want to work with.
Yeah, I mean, talk about great engineers. You and the rest of the team, the early team are special. I mean, uh, there is, the Stripe Mafia. So Greg Brockman started, OpenAI and now helps run it, and, he started Render. And so, how did Stripe end up getting, these special people at the beginning? Even I would imagine even before Capture the Flag, you know, there's also Grace who also started a company. So there's like a lot of great people that end up at Stripe, but especially early on, how did Stripe recruit such a great set of people?
I think it was all part of um, the network that started with the founders, with Patrick and John, and um, they had already gone through YC once before with the company that they sold to this Canadian company, and so they had this YC network, and so some of the engineers early on when I joined, three or four of the engineers were all former founders. Um, and having early employees who have been entrepreneurs before goes a really long way to moving fast, to building a great product. You know, and that sort of feeds on itself, and then you attract other people like that. Really, I think credit goes to the founders, John Patrick, and their network. And then when they attracted these other great people in their network, then their networks. And so I remember our first designer, Ludwig, who also started another company that they sold to Twitter, I think. He came in through another engineer, Ross, who Patrick knew from prior YC experience. So it was all the network, and really making sure that um, that people understood what they were, uh, who they were going to work with, and then it was a really good group of people who really cared a lot about the craft and about developer experience and making sure that the product was the best in the world. I think that made all the difference.
That's really interesting to hear. So, I mean, after Stripe, I guess you started Creso, right? Um, and and right now, machine learning is all the hype and everything, but you're ahead of the curve. So, can you tell us a little bit more about Creso? What was the motivation behind it, and the lesson that you've learned on that venture?
Yeah, so after I left Stripe in 2016, I was looking for a large, ambitious problem that I could take on, um, mostly because I was in that position where I didn't have to look for a job right away because of Stripe's success. And so I felt it was a responsibility in many ways to do something that I cared about deeply, but also that was solving a big problem in the world. And I spent a lot of time thinking through the different problem domains and building small projects in them. And as part of doing that, deep learning was just sort of becoming popular at the time. And I took this course online that was run by Jeremy Howard, who runs Fast AI. Um, and I noticed that there were a ton of people trying to set up a Jupyter notebook backed by a GPU. And AWS back then was the only cloud with a GPU instance, and there was just one instance type. But NVIDIA's libraries and all the other software on top required a lot of fiddling around to get it to work well on an AWS instance that had a GPU connected to it. And data scientists who were taking the deep learning course at the same course that I was taking, they just didn't really want to deal with any of that. And all they wanted to do was click a button and get a notebook that had a GPU so they could train some models on it. So that's what I built because I'd always cared deeply about developer productivity. And as I was going through my explorations, I kept getting drawn to infrastructure. And excuse me. And so Kressel was just a solution to a problem that I saw that I felt excited about solving. And then it grew from there. And then I kind of realized that because I'm not a data scientist, I don't actually feel that kind of empathy that I need, I think, with the people I'm building things for. And so I kind of put Kressel on almost like maintenance mode to continue to think about what I wanted to do next. Um, and and then I decided that actually, well, I love, like I said, developer productivity, and I love infrastructure. And the right combination of that is actually a much bigger thing than Kressel. Um, and I wanted to build something for other developers like me. But I also knew that building anything online at the time that was even mildly complex, a full stack application, just required the same set of steps over and over and over again on AWS. And Heroku was stagnated and didn't really have the features I wanted. So it was very clear that this was a big problem that a lot of companies were facing, and none of the big clouds were doing anything about it, or they were trying to and failing, and then there were really no other great options. So that's kind of how Render came about. And when I spent more time on Render, I realized that this is actually what I want to work on, and this is actually what I'm excited about. So then I ended up sending out a tweet saying, "Hey, Cressel's doing well. It has a lot of data scientists on it, but I'm looking for people to take it over." And I ended up selling the company for a small amount through that tweet. But then I was able to focus fully on Render.
That's funny. How Twitter like becomes connected to the real world. You know, it's so interesting because sometimes when you tweet, you're like, oh, you know, it's going to the void, but you end up selling a company through a tweet, which is like very, very interesting. It's a really cool story to hear.
Yeah, I think Twitter, now X, is an amazing connector of especially folks in the developer and tech space. I actually found Uma, who's our VP of engineering. I DM'd her on X and asked if she would be interested in chatting. Um, and that's how we met initially. So X has been great for Render and for growing our network.
That's a really cool story. It's kind of interesting. I was talking to Michael Gibson, who ran the Two Fellowship for some time, and he ended up, I think, helping select, for example, Vitalik, who started Ethereum. And I mean, if you've heard of cryptocurrencies and things like that, Ethereum, you know, it's the
Of
second biggest
course.
one. And we're talking about it, how now the internet is kind of Rome, like it's kind of you can connect to anyone on the internet, and it became this sort of connector where you can find anyone. And for example, X is a great way to find people. Joke that, you know, it's not on LinkedIn that you're going to find people, but on X. But I mean, you just gave an example of someone great in your team that end up joining as VP of engineering, right? And yeah, so that's really, really interesting. So you talked a little bit about the motivation behind it, right? So I mean, there wasn't a great cloud tool to build websites and apps. Heroku was basically acquired, and it was acquired, and there wasn't as much development into it. There was AWS, but there wasn't a simple and easy tool to build apps and websites and things like that. And since then, you raised money, you raised your, you know, to the Series B, which was announced, where you raised, I think, $50 million. But you know, you also won TechCrunch Disrupt. I think 2019, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And there were, I would imagine, different inflection points. Were there like specific inflection points where you were like, oh, Render has legs, and you're actually seeing a lot of developers starting to use, and more companies use Render? And like, what were the inflection points for Render?
Yeah. So Render, as of August of 2023, has over 650,000 developers on the platform. This number is up from just about 100K in August of last year. So I think a big piece of our growth just over the last year has been the deprecation of Heroku's free tier, which has then created a lot more awareness around Render, because people first discover us as an alternative to the free tier that no longer exists on Heroku, but then they see that we can do so much more than Heroku, that they don't need Kubernetes, that they don't need AWS and set all of that up yourself. So that's kind of been um, a great inflection point for us, not just obviously for awareness with people who are looking for free hosting, but also for people who are just looking for um, an alternative, a better alternative to everything that exists today, including both Heroku and Kubernetes. Um, and before that, I think the goal with Render has always been to continue to grow with our users in many ways, like early Stripe. And a lot of startups have started on Render and grown over time, and in some cases to over $1 billion in valuation and hundreds of engineers on their teams and just running everything, all their infrastructure on Render. Um, so there hasn't been one major inflection point. It's been a series of constant work, constant scaling, making sure that our systems stay up at all times. I think for an early company, especially, over the platform launched publicly at TechCrunch Disrupt in 2019, and we got a lot of people in, but then we also saw a lot of abuse and fraud, and so we faced early on in 2019, 2020, there were instances of downtime because of DDoS attacks, and so we've had to build out protections against that, and I think all of those things continue to make Render an incredibly stable, reliable, secure platform for our users, and people see that. And there are people who first saw Render in 2019 or 2020, and Render didn't have the features that they wanted at the time. So, for example, Postgres point-in-time recovery is something that you often need when, well, hopefully not often, but you do need it if you issue a bad query in production that nukes your database in a way that is irrecoverable, unless you have a rollback point that you can go to. So that feature we launched that feature publicly just a couple of months ago. But if you wanted that feature and Render didn't have it, even though you knew about Render, you didn't use it. So I think over the course of the last several years, we've continued to grow the platform by continuing to add features and then continue to focus on reliability and security. And that has led to steady growth, despite, again, in our case, we haven't really spent anything on marketing. We don't even have a marketing team right now. We don't have a sales team. All our growth so far has been entirely word of mouth, and we're doing really well in terms of just where we are with revenue as well.
That's awesome to hear. I think that's the best when it's all word of mouth. But it would be interesting to know some of the stories regarding fraud, or like how, uh, you know, if you have any interesting stories. I've heard, for example, that when Ethereum was proof of work, there were a lot of people looking for GPUs. Now people want to run neural nets everywhere. So, people are looking for GPUs, free GPUs, wherever they can find. So do you have any interesting stories that you can share? Or?
Oh yeah, I mean, we have all kinds of abuse on our platform, and even though we don't offer GPUs out of the box, people are still using the CPUs we offer, and so we actually have systems now that can figure out if you're mining on the platform and automatically alert us. You don't have to go look at what you're actually doing. It's based on the CPU activity, but also the patterns that exist in that kind of activity. We have always had um, interesting cases of abuse where we early on, you don't really put a bunch of limits in place. You just want to get the features out there, and then suddenly someone comes in and decides to spin up 1,000 instances of their service just because each instance is then mining something in the CPU, and then all of a sudden you are running out of your public cloud quotas, or legitimate people can't spin up a new service because you've reached those limits. And so that has happened in the past, where obviously our systems are much more sophisticated now. Um, but early on, yeah, we saw a lot of that. And with every new inflection point in terms of real users, you also see an inflection in terms of people who want to abuse your platform, because I think the more you grow, the more people know about you, but also the more fraudsters know about you as well. So people who want to abuse your platform. So I think it's always a cat and mouse game. Um, but we also have had situations where there's a bunch of GitHub repos that show people how to run some sort of bot that is either executing maybe a DDoS attack, or is downloading pirated software, or is actually mining um, for crypto. And we see these repos, they're public repos, and we have a deploy to render button that anyone can add to their repo, to their GitHub or GitLab repo, that allows them to deploy whatever's in that repo in a single click and deploy it onto render. And so all these repos that are very clearly abused have these deploy to render buttons on them. And we like the use of the deploy to render button. However, um, we then have to go in and really, block repos themselves, block GitHub repos, and then people have instructions on. In that repo, we see people leaving instructions on how to bypass the render repo block. And sometimes you just want to open a PR and say, just don't do this, guys. Um, and I've actually left so someone raised an issue on one of these repos saying, hey, this doesn't work on render anymore. And I remember going in and leaving a comment on that issue saying, yeah, this shouldn't really work on render. And
That's
so
so
the
funny.
person who had that repo, they decided to remove the deploy to render button, which was very nice of them. But I don't know if it actually stopped a lot of people from using render for that repo.
That's funny. So I guess, I mean, there are some problems, that you encounter. Some of them you mentioned, like running into cloud limits, and that that render had. But what were the hardest parts, like, of running a startup, and what are the best parts? Like, yeah.
Um, I think the hardest parts are always around building the right team, and making sure that everyone is moving in the same direction. And I often liken it to um, a rowboat competition, a rowing competition where every boat is a startup that has all these people who are supposed to do a very specific thing on the boat, and they all have to do it in a way that is synchronized, and they all have to pull their weight, literally pull their weight. Um, and if you don't have that kind of synchronization, if you don't have the people who are great at what they do, the best in the world at what they do, then you can't go fast. And it's all about going fast at startups, because you're essentially, if you're not profitable, you're always running out of money by definition. So I think it's all about making sure that um, that everyone is moving in the same direction, is pulling their weight, is doing the things that they're supposed to do to the best of their abilities, and is able to do those things, and has the experience and the skills to do those things. And as the company gets bigger, it just takes more work. It was much easier when we won TechCrunch Disrupt. We were 4 people, and we were all sitting around a table, and it was pre-COVID, and so everyone was in the office every day, and communication was really easy. But now we have many more people who are remote, and it just takes more work. And not just because of the remote thing, but also, we have separate teams. They all have sort of their own goals, and we need to make sure that everyone's aligned. So communication, synchronization, hiring, all of these things go into building the best company you can. And I think that's always the hardest part of any startup. And that's also true for Render. The best parts of running Render, and this is perhaps specific to Render, um, I think that I would say two things. One is just when you get the rowboat to move fast with the people you enjoy hanging out with, it's just very special. And having people at the company who are all focused on the same thing and rowing in the same direction at the same speed, I think that is when that happens, it's special and it feels great. It feels, especially as a founder and CEO, it feels great because as the company grows, you really can't do everything yourself. And you have to rely more and more and more on other people to do it. So when all these people are doing the things that you would have done or that you would have done less well, they're doing it better than you. That's the ideal. So that's really great to see. And then the second thing that is especially gratifying for Render is when I see developers using the platform, being really productive with their apps, and teams being able to move really fast because they're on Render. Startups that are 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 people able to just get their work done much faster and iterate faster. And then when they talk about it on Twitter, like the word of mouth growth is all we have right now. And so when people talk about it online, that's just very gratifying because that is really what I set out to do with the company. And we continue to do that. But when we see that out in the world and people truly appreciating what we're doing, developers, especially people who are like us, that's the best part of building a company like Render.
Yeah, Render is awesome. I've
Thank you.
used before, and it's such a great product. So easy to use. Auto deployments and things like that are really, really helpful. So you talked a little bit about remote, right? And that's something that seems a little bit different from maybe when Stripe started. Even Stripe now, I think, is doing remote. I mean,
Yes.
I think they already had offices in different areas, if I'm not mistaken, but now they have remote people. Are you seeing any trends there? Like, and how do you see remote changing the way you approach talent? Because I mean, before remote was such a standard practice, at least for earlier companies. I think most companies would have everyone in the office. So how are you seeing that, and are you seeing any trends? And are you, like, how do you see that changing the way you approach talent?
Yeah, I don't think Render is particularly special in this regard. Like the rest of the world, um, we changed our approach to hiring when COVID hit because everyone was remote and no one was able to go into the office, and developers knew that more and more developers were looking for remote roles. And so in that sense, I think it it was obvious to us that we needed the best talent. And if we needed the best talent, we had to consider people who were looking to work remotely. And even though we're in the Bay Area, right, we're in San Francisco, we're in the middle of perhaps the biggest talent nexus in the world when it comes to what we're doing. There are a lot of wonderful engineers and also other people who are not engineers, but who have incredible skills that you need for a startup. They're not all in San Francisco in the Bay Area. The San Francisco and the Bay Area are also very good at driving people out because of the high costs. And that has only increased over the pandemic. So many people have moved out of California and out of the Bay Area. So we adjusted our approach to hiring when it came to remote, and then that never changed back. Now that we have an office and we have people coming into the office, We still continue to hire for engineering, at least remotely, and we have our customer support engineering team that is also remote. We have folks in Australia. That's also for coverage. We have folks in Australia, multiple folks in Europe, obviously folks on both coasts in the US. And I think every company has had to adapt to how it allows remote engineers and remote hires to feel more included. And that's something that you just have to very consciously work on. You can't just assume that it will happen. And you have to keep creating opportunities for remote folks to connect with the rest of the company in the same way you would if you were together. And a lot of that involves bringing people together. So at Render, if you're remote, we want you to come to the office at least once a quarter, to the office in San Francisco. And we obviously pay for all of it. And if you want to come down more frequently, that's great. I think it's just incredibly hard to get the same kind of bandwidth over Zoom. There are so many signals that you can't convey over Zoom that help people have higher bandwidth conversations. And again, when it comes to startups, you have to move fast. And so that's where being in the same room can sometimes have a big advantage. But at the same time, you also need, for some roles, you just need to be by yourself and you need to think and do deep work. And so being remote certainly lets you do that. And it's a balance. So it's something we're figuring out ourselves. We continue to find ways for people who are remote at Render to be more included. And a lot of that has to do with technology, but also it just has to do with finding opportunities for them to come out here to San Francisco and just hang out with the team with no agenda, really.
Interesting. Yeah. Just a side note, in 2013, I had started a company and we raised early money. So we raised like $2 million, something like that. And we ended up hiring someone that was remote in San Diego. And at the time, a lot of companies didn't have remote. Funnily enough, he is now working at Stripe because Stripe now hires remote. And he's one of the best engineers I worked with, but he lived in San Diego. And I think it's a wonderful thing that you can have these opportunities that you wouldn't have. There are a lot of great people that live in different areas, and they wouldn't have access to these opportunities. So I'm really glad that there are more opportunities for people. This opens up a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, I think having some level of synchronous communication is still essential. So we try to hire, at least on the engineering side, we hire folks in North America. We're not hiring people in Europe or other places because of the need for overlap. And it's not that we haven't tried it. Just the kind of company we are, we found that it only really works well if the remote overlap is significant.
100%. Yeah, same here. So another thing that would be interesting to know, you're seeing more earlier company stages, like you're growing, like the companies at Render are growing with Render,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them. Are you seeing any trends in terms of like the types of companies or even the location of companies? So for example, if you're seeing companies in England or, Israel or like other countries, like any kind of interesting trends there?
Yeah, so actually, when we look at just pure signups, Render has more signups from the rest of the world combined than the US. So we're
Wow.
very international in that sense. And that was somewhat surprising. That was somewhat surprising to me when it first started happening. However, I think a lot of our revenue still comes from American companies. And I think it's followed by companies in England and Germany, and maybe other parts of Europe. Um, what I do see changing is a lot of AI companies on render, as you can imagine. Um, our top customer list now includes many more companies with AI in their domain, either .ai or -AI, and then even the companies that don't have that are trying a lot of things related to AI on render, and that's the one bright spot in the startup economy, um, which again we see a lot of because we have this very wide exposure to startups, and that's really interesting. And this was different last year, pre FTX collapse. We saw a bunch of .eth domains. Um, so again, render is almost like an index of the startup economy and what's hot in startups. And so, these days it's .ai, and who knows what it's going to be this time next year.
And that's fun. Yeah, I've heard the same thing. I talked to Colin, who's our clerk, and he was seeing a lot of growth as well for AI companies, which I think is very interesting. Also,
Yeah.
another interesting thing that I think has been changing a little bit is the way companies are being built. So, one of my friends was at Stripe as well early on, and he was telling me that for Stripe, uh, I don't think Stripe adopted as many SaaS providers as like other companies. So even Stripe, if you think about Stripe, like before Stripe existed, the way you process money, I mean, there was Braintree, maybe it's heard before,
Yeah.
but it wasn't as easy. And there are more and more SaaS providers. Have you seen SaaS providers change or the number of employees, engineers trend lower compared to the size of the company, or how like SaaS companies have changed the way like render is being built compared to what you saw at Stripe?
I think so. And I think render is also part of that trend. What we do for our customers is we allow them to get a lot more done without having to hire many more engineers. And um, a bunch of other companies are doing something similar, not in the cloud space, but in other areas, right? And um, engineer hiring remains incredibly hard across the board because more and more companies are becoming software driven, and we're only able to mint so many new engineers every year. And so many engineering jobs continue to go unfilled every year. So there will always be a lot of value in building something that reduces the need for custom engineering work or for things that can be otherwise automated by software. So I think as more companies evolve to use these software providers, we'll continue to see the average size of the startup that is able to achieve a given thing. The average size will continue to scale down. And obviously, we're now seeing the rise of generative AI, which is able to help in certain areas for sure. There's obviously a lot of content generation that you need a lot of people for before GPT. And then we all use Copilot, which is great. I don't think it replaces engineers really. It just makes everyone a little more productive, which is great. Um, and we'll see what else LLMs have in store. But that's just the nature of human progress, I think. Things continue to get automated, they continue to get abstracted away. And we continue to need less and less labor. And that's not specific to the software industry. It's true for really any industry. If you can automate it, you will, because just labor is expensive. And in the end, I mean, it's kind of the story of capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. And yeah, I agree 100% in the GPT and how engineers are becoming more productive. And I think these tools are just going to make us more and more productive, which is really cool to see. That was an awesome conversation. We're about time. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate. Thank you. And people can find you. Where can people find you and find Render?
The render is render.com. And I am available over email. My first name, Anurag, ANURAG @render.com. Yeah, I'm really happy to chat, answer questions about Render at any time, and happy to help with anything I can. And thank you so much, you, for having me. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.